cohorts were stronger than the good morning in the room, because that wasn't very strong. Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, that's a little bit better. How many of you grew up in a conservative home? I'm not saying my home was conservative, but my dad has never worn a pair of shorts in his life. I'm not saying that my parents were conservative, but my mom has never had her ears pierced and she's in her mid-70s. I'm not saying that my parents were conservative, but my dad kind of thought you were sinning if you were sick and stayed home from church on Sunday morning. That's a little bit on the conservative side. My dad was so conservative that at one point in time, in his life, he was pretty convinced that if you didn't answer every altar call, you probably weren't going to heaven. My great-grandma, she was a conservative Pentecostal, not raised that way, came to Christ in her adulthood, and had led a definite checkered past by the time she got there. But Granny was so conservative that if someone did not go, if they got newly saved, she'd say, well, they say they're saved, but I'm not so sure because they didn't go to the youth rally Monday evening. Youth rally that we had to travel to get there. Granny, you're in your 70s. Most people aren't going to youth rallies. She just wasn't convinced you were even saved if you didn't do that stuff. My parents, my family were so conservative that when Dad was pastoring a church in Minnesota, and they bought a parsonage, and the parsonage came within the basement. There was a pool table. The family didn't want to move out. So it came with a pool table. When he announced it in the business meeting that the church was going to buy this house and it came with a pool table, he thought the deal was over right there. That's how conservative the church was. The church was so conservative. Holiness was defined primarily by 2 or 3 scriptures. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, which says in the King James, avoid the very appearance of evil. So I just, as a thought experiment, asked my wife last night, what does that verse mean? And she kind of hemmed and hawed, and then I said, what did it mean to the generation of Pentecostals before our parents? And she said very quickly, don't wear makeup, keep your hair long, don't wear anything but skirts, don't go roller skating, don't go bowling, don't go into any place that's questionable, she had a long list of anybody grow up in a house like that? Am I the only one? A couple of us grew up like that, yeah. I grew up in a place where holiness was defined by what you wore, what you did, and who you'd even talk to. And if you talk to the wrong person, you might not be holy. Somehow you were made unclean by that, right, Jonathan? So if you even talk to the person who looked like they might not be okay, you are not avoiding the appearance of evil. You talk to Mike Savage, and hello, Mike. You might not be, that's the wrong person. I don't know why, but just don't bother. So I grew up in this kind of environment. And I went to college in a place that was significantly more conservative than I was. And we would get in these conversations, and people would come up with start to throw that verse out. And I quickly learned that verse, avoid the very appearance of evil, could be used to say, don't do anything I don't want you to do. Now, right, Dr. Searle, you've been around long enough to remember those days, right? If I didn't like the fact that Dr. Searle is wearing a really nice pink shirt and pink tie, Dr. Searle, I know what they say about brothers who are wearing pink. You need to avoid the very appearance of evil. You've been on the wrong side of the bridge too long. And if you think I'm making it up, go visit some old school Pentecostals. Go to the South because it's still a haven for that kind of stuff. And not that they were loving Jesus in the way they knew how. It's how it was a response. Historically, it is largely a response. Here comes the professor in me. It's largely a response to the frontier days in which there was total mayhem and debauchery. And when revival broke out in 1800 in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, they wrote before the revival that most everyone on the frontier was drunk 24 hours a day. That there were all sorts of fights and problems so that you feared for your life on a continual basis. And when revival broke out, they began to preach under the direction of Cartwright and a few others. They began to preach and teach in 1800 in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, that they had to get their lives straight. And out of the Second Great Awakening came such things as the Prohibition movement 100 years after that. Also came women's suffrage and a whole bunch of social movements, but out of that came Prohibition and that kind of a conservative holiness mentality. And it hung on for a long time. On top of that verse, there was also the verse in Peter. You know, the one that says that women should pay and these things always seem to have to do with women. That because it was men making up the rules. Just saying. All right. So then there was the other verses in Peter that said that a woman should work on adorning the inner character and not the outside, the braiding of hair, and all of these other things. And that list became, in a fundamentalist way, a list of things to avoid. And that defined holiness. That kind of mentality then prevented us from seeing other things. And it prevented us from interpreting some portions of Scripture in ways that they probably should be interpreted. Because we only had one mentality. So we read Jesus and his interaction with the Pharisees, and we thought that he was rebuking them for particular things about hypocrisy. And we make a big deal of that word when that was not exact. Yes, he used the word a lot, but that was probably not his emphasis. His emphasis was slightly different. It comes from the Old Testament word that appears over 220 times, 127 times in the Psalms alone. And it goes by various renditions in the English. It is often spelled H-E-S-E-D, but it is not an H sound that begins the word. It's one of those Hebrew sounds that's not really a CH. It's not really an H. Sometimes you'll see it KH because it's kind of chesed. And it is an important word in the Old Testament. Vital, in fact. Now, I know what you're thinking, Dr. Coates. I'm a Bible college student. How come I've never heard of the word? Well, I ask myself the same question. How did I get a bachelor's degree and not know the word? My undergraduate degree is in Bible also. How did I not know the word? How did I have to get to seminary to learn the word? Well, maybe that's just the result of various levels of learning, but maybe it's also the result of the fact that not everybody understands the importance of that concept in Old Testament theology and what it meant for Jesus and Jesus' half-brother James, and for Peter, and for everyone else. And so we listen to a few verses that seem to define what we think walking in the kingdom means. And we forget that it means also hesed. So let's define the word, shall we? Dr. Coates, you said you're not into definitions. I'm not, but this one is really going to help you. The word does not translate into English very well. You can translate it as love, but it is not love like we think. It certainly is not love like some of the Greek words in the New Testament. You can translate it loving kindness, which is what some translations do, but loving kindness tends to be very sentimental and soft, and that's not what the word is. You could translate it loyal, and in some contexts it clearly is about loyalty. So that has led some to say that it's probably best translated as a loyal love, loyal loving, which was a major concept. How do I know it's a major concept? When God wished to rebuke Israel in the book of Hosea, he rebuked them according to Hosea chapter 6 for their lack of loyal loving. He rebuked them because they had broken the covenant of loyal love with him. And he went so far as to hard-hitting stuff, so far as to say, what people have ever left their God, but you have left me, and played the part of the whore. Isn't that a great way to be rebuked at a chapel in the morning? Wouldn't that be wonderful at a Devo, 7:45 in the morning, someone stands up and say, y'all are a bunch of prostitutes. That's what Hosea was saying. You guys have left your God and you have broken your loving, loyal bond. That was his rebuke. Amos's rebuke was something similar. Amos said, you have broken the bond that was supposed to be the glue holding our society together. The loving loyalty to each other. Look at somebody sitting next to you and say, I'm supposed to be loyal to you. Look the other way and say, you? I got to be loyal to you? I just want to know who gets to look at Pastor Rondell and say that to him. Because that's what the Old Testament was about over and over and over again. And when you read the rebukes throughout the prophets, that is very much, it's not the word, it's the content. Over and over again, they were rebuked not because they were globbing on to evil, but because they had broken faith with God, because they had broken off that loyal, loving bond that was supposed to be there going this direction, and because they had forsaken that loyal, loving bond that was supposed to go this direction between people. And when they completely broke that, things fell apart. Their society fell apart. They started to worship all sorts of idols. They created gods out of wood, out of stone, out of gold. And Isaiah prophesied and laughed at them and said, you go to the same block of wood and you carve an idol and you say, behold my God, and you take the rest of the wood and you chop it up for fire and you use that fire to fashion the God. And then you chop up a little bit more and you heat your house with it. And you chop up a little bit more and you use it for just normal everyday uses. And that's your God. Not much of a God, he says. When they broke off their loyal, loving bond between them and God, everything went south from there. But as if that bond wasn't enough, as is always the case, when you break that bond, you pervert and twist the bond between humans. The glue that's supposed to hold together their society. And in the New Testament, the glue that's supposed to hold together a church or a campus or a cohort is the loyal, loving bond that comes between people. That is not optional. It's not something that you can say, yeah, that's kind of a nice add-on, Dr. Coates. It is built on the foundation of the Trinity. 1 Corinthians chapter number 12 brings that up in verses 4 through 6. All three members of the Trinity are mentioned, and they are mentioned in a parallel fashion with only two words being different in each of the phrases in the Greek. And those words are the word for Father, the word for Lord, and the word for Spirit. And then the three words having to do with what they do. But they are not designating roles or anything like that. It doesn't seem, because it's not consistent. It is the parallel in the Greek is intended to say they're all the same. They're all together. That's verse number 6. Then verse number 7 says, and this one Spirit gives gifts. And then he lists 9 charismatic gifts. And then after the 9 charismatic gifts are listed in verse number 11, and verse number 12, Paul breaks into now the body of Christ, and he does that until verse number 25 or 26. Then in verse number 27, he says, now given by the same Spirit are different gifts, and he lists a different set of gifts there. It is all built, the diversity in the body, the glue that holds us all together, everything about who we are is all built on the model of who God is himself. So when you break bond with the person next to him, it's like you're saying the Father and the Son don't really get along. It's like you're saying the Spirit is the Spirit of Christ, but he doesn't get along with Christ, and I don't have to get along with you. I just have to love you, I don't have to like you, and I don't have to talk to you. And the New Testament looks at you and gives you the sticking out the tongue emoji. Saying, you crazy if you think that's what this means. And in the Old Testament, Ezekiel's getting ready to be caught up by his hair in a vision because of that. Because that is not the biblical picture whatsoever. The biblical picture is where you are caught up in this loyal, loving bond with each other in such a manner that you will not give it up no matter what. Where you might even take a bullet for that bum you call a roommate. My college roommates do not listen to my chapel sermons, so I guess I could get away with that. God love him. One of them, his father just passed away this week. I'm not trying to be mean to Brad. He's a great guy. And nor am I trying to be mean to Matt Harris, who won't get on Facebook to save his life. In fact, you can't even find an email address for him on the internet, even though he's a pastor. I had great roommates, but, sometimes your roommates get under your nerves. Sometimes they standing on the last nerve that you had left, and you look at, am I making this up, or is this dorm life? This is dorm life. You know what happens, though? We just don't want to admit it because they're the same people we got to walk back after chapel with. So we don't want to say amen too loudly, but in our hearts, we're jumping up and down and waving hankies. The truth is sometimes the people in our lives really get under our skin, do they not? I mean, people who are married, I mean, you love your wife, Pastor Rondell, right? I mean, dearly, you guys really love each other. But sometimes you annoy her, don't you? Yes. I mean, you're not trying to, but just sometimes by breathing, I find I ignore my wife. And I know that in that moment, what holds you together is supposed to be the glue of a loyal, loving bond that says, look, I stood at the altar and promised till death do us part. Unless you're killing me, we're in this together. That's what it's supposed to be. That's what it's supposed to be in the church. Unless you're killing me, we are in this together, we're staying in this together, and there is nothing you can do about it. I started to do doctoral research in an anthropology study methods class. Took a class at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. It's going to transfer into my program. It was taught by a classic anthropologist, Dr. Baldwin, who I didn't know at the time, but had studied Pentecostals and had written kind of one of the only good anthropology articles about Pentecostals, and it was kind of a divine providential moment, and he taught us study methods, and he said, first day of class, you're going to go out and find a group of people, a discrete group of people, he loved the word discrete, a discrete group of people which you will stick with for the entire term and study. I decided I'm going to study churches, so I'll just go to church. And so I contacted a pastor I knew in the area. They had a Sunday night service that was designated for 20s and 30s. I wasn't 20 or 30. I was in my 40s, but I said, hey, can I come? And I told him what I was doing. He said, yeah, that's fine. Go ahead and come. He said, but don't tell anybody who I am or what I'm doing there. Just treat me like I'm a guest. I said, okay, I can do that. And so I visited the church multiple times, and it was at that time in Milwaukee, not everybody turned their lights off to worship. A lot of people did, but not everybody. Not everybody used stage lighting, and not everybody did those things. And so I made that part of my research, and I started to ask questions. And I asked the people of the church some questions, and I asked him some questions. And one of those questions was something like this. Not every church looks like this, or sounds like this, or acts like this. Kind of looks like a concert. Kind of sounds like a concert. If it looks like a concert and it sounds like a secular concert, what's different? And then I got a variety of answers. And then I asked the pastor another follow-up question, and the answer was very revealing. It's an answer that I had not really thought of before, but I heard it repeated again after that in research. I asked him, when you talk to your people about being different from the world, how do you talk about that? Now, I expected fully that the answer was going to be, we don't really talk about that. In fact, he said he talked about it all the time. I knew they weren't talking about what you wear. I could see that. I knew they weren't talking about strobe lights and that, because I could see all of that. And I really wanted to know, if you are talking about this at all, how are you talking about this? And here is the answer. You ready? Look at your neighbor and say, wake up. This is the right time. If you online, put your coffee down, your latte, and just hang on for a moment, all right? This would be a great time to jump on Facebook online and say, Dr. Coates, I'm still with you. And then jump back and listen. Here we go. Here's what he said. I think you're different from the world when you forgive someone's offenses. I think you're different from the world when you love like Jesus loves. And as that answer or something like that became repeated to me over and over again, I decided that there was an old, ancient definition of being different that was coming back in. That was no longer about whether or not you had your right biceps tattooed. And was not really fully about whether or not his name is tattooed on your heart, but was very much about whether or not you lived out, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That was defined very much by the ancient concept of loyal loving. Loyal loving that says, I will loyally love God. And I will be devoted to him no matter what. And I will not be disloyal to God. I want you to contemplate for a moment the ways in your life right now in which you might be loyal to God. What are you doing that really shows that you're loyal to him? And there are probably a lot of those things. But then I want you to contemplate the second question. which I think probably is a little bit more meddling in your heart. How are you being disloyal to him? The reason why idolatry was so bad in the Old Testament was because it was disloyal to God. It had nothing to do with worship per se. It was all about your loyal loving toward God. The reason why they had broken faith was not because they were wearing their skirts too short. Nor was it because their women had shaved their heads, according to Isaiah. It was because they had broken their loyal loving bond with the Almighty. They no longer had the same sense of, I will die for him. Some of them no doubt did, but a whole bunch of them didn't, to the point where when Elijah was talking to God, he said, God, there is no one who has a loyal, loving bond with you in the entire nation but me. And God's rebuke was that in a nation of hundreds of thousands of people, no, I've got a couple thousand who still do. A couple thousand in God's chosen people who had not broken faith. They were so far off from where they ought to be. And however they had defined it, it does not seem that they stopped keeping the law. So the law in the Old Testament is not just the Ten Commandments, though the Ten Commandments become a symbol for the law. And when you think of the law as in Ray Comfort, correct them from the law to win them to Christ, time does not permit for me to give you a full critique of Ray Comfort. All I'm going to say is that in the law, in the Old Testament, they had separated out so that they had 613 laws. And it seems like they kept quite a few of them. They certainly kept the ones about feasts, because God says in Isaiah, I abhor your feasts. They were keeping the feasts. They were keeping a lot of those kinds of laws. They weren't sacrificing like they should, but they were keeping a lot of the law. But God said, I don't really care that you're keeping all the law. Why? Because you don't have a loyal, loving bond. It is not your sacrifices I want, but it's your loyal, loving bond of your heart. It is not the feast that I want. It is the loyal, loving bond. It is not the external things that I want. It is the loyal, loving bond that is not a sentimental bond, but it is a bond of discipline that says I will discipline my heart to be glued to the Almighty so that no matter what happens, I will stay in tune with him. And over again, the prophets rebuked them because they had broken that bond. But the prophets didn't stop there. The prophets began to look at how are they treating each other. And they said what was supposed to be a cohesive society has broken down. Now let me know when it sounds like I'm describing America, okay? What was once a cohesive society is broken down. No longer do neighbors look out for neighbors. They don't even know each other. No longer are you concerned about the disenfranchised and the disadvantaged. And when you are, you're throwing them mere pittance. You're throwing them just some of the leftovers, and you're not really taking care of them. You have abandoned those who are already abandoned, leaving them to fend for themselves. Now, many of you are probably on board at this point in time saying, yeah, that sounds like America. Others of you are saying, Dr. Coates, I thought you were raised in a liberal household. What happened? Are you a Hillary Clinton supporter? This has absolutely nothing to do with politics and everything to do with theology. Everything to do with it. And unless you think I'm wrong about that, feel free to send all of your hate mail. The email address is msavage, S-A-V-A-G-E, @SUM. No, you can feel free to interact with me if you'd like to. Call me a pagan, call me a heathen. You do it on your own private Facebook pages for your cohort, and you're a coward. Come to my page and say it to my face. Why? Because the ancient concept of the loyal, loving bond says that if you disagree with me, you come directly to me. That's how Jesus interpreted it. Jesus interpreted that if there's a problem between brothers, leave whatever you have at the altar and go take care of it. That's the reason he said it. Because there's a loyal, loving bond between brothers and sisters that says we keep this in-house between us. My sister's got a problem with me. My sister ought to be talking to me. My daughter's got a problem with me. They need to be talking to me. My son-in-law's got a problem with me. Talk to my daughter and then talk to me. My future son-in-law's got a problem with me. Marry her before you talk to me about it. And the future daughter-in-law, wherever she is, Benjamin, would you just get on the stick, please? That future daughter-in-law, we got to have to wait a while before we get to that comment. But I do know this. If my wife's got a problem with me, we handle that between the two of us. We go on a walk with the dog, and sometimes we leave the dog at home lest she gossip. That's how family is, isn't it? You don't have to be religious to know that. Isn't that the law of a gang? The brothers on the street. You got a problem with me, we bring it in-house and we deal with it ourselves. You don't take it to anyone else. If they get it, why can't we? That's what Jesus said. Jesus said that if the pagans, the heathen, the tax collectors can love each other, you have done nothing by loving each other. Love your enemies. Man, we haven't even figured out how to have a loyal, loving bond with each other sometimes. First Baptist, Second Baptist, Third Baptist, Fourth Baptist. Main Street separates us all. And we wonder why love doesn't flow down the city square. It's because you won't even get together and shake hands with your Baptist brother. It's because you're convinced that your brother may not even be a brother, because he disagrees with you about one theological point as though you're right on everything. Such arrogance was addressed in Micah. This is what the Lord requires of you: to show mercy, to have a loving, loyal bond, to do justice, to walk humbly before your God. And some of the issues over time that developed with the old idea of holiness was an exceptional arrogance. You think I'm wrong? Check out the organ player in my home church who met young ladies at the door to tell them they would have looked much better if they'd worn a dress to the house of God. Now, if they were in the youth group, they could have dealt with that because they all knew who she was. They were there for the first time. You don't think that sends an arrogant message? You're not wanted here if you don't match our dress code? Don't you think every restaurant in America that has a dress code is a little high-minded? And a church does? Well, we've gotten over that, right? Churches don't have a problem with that. It's just that we haven't replaced it with anything that was biblical. We've just replaced it with permissiveness, where you can do anything you want to do and nobody calls you out on it. That's not what a loyal, loving bond was. A loyal, loving bond included meeting at the city square to take care of some issues. It includes one sister going to another saying, hey, we need to talk. And if you can't make it right there, bringing another sister in, because that's what Jesus said to do. And he said to do it because in the Old Testament concept, in the Jewish concept in which Jesus was raised, the loyal, loving bond dominated the stage. But for the time in which we came out of the holiness movement, we couldn't even interpret the book of James. Do you know how long it was as a pastor's kid before this is no indictment on my dad. This was every pastor's kid. Everyone who grew up in a Pentecostal church in my generation, very few of them knew that James said this is pure religion: to feed the widows, to take care of the orphans, to visit those who are sick. We got one of them. We would visit the sick. The orphans, the widows, those in prison, maybe and maybe not. It was up for grabs. We now do it under the auspices of social justice. The problem with social justice is that it has not come out of a loyal, loving bond. It is completely steeped in expressive sentimentality of our age. Therefore, I have to define it by whether or not I feel good doing it. Do I feel good helping this poor person? And if I don't help them. It had nothing to do with trying to bring them back into a right relationship with society. It had nothing to do with taking them from where they were and saying, hey, let's help you a little bit. Not just with $5. Let's get some things right in your life. Let's put you back into a community that loves you and cares about you. And let's see if you can thrive and flourish in that community. And that community will look out for you and will help you. What I'm defining is, some of you are saying, you're not telling me anything new, Dr. Coates. Maybe that's because you're in a church that's already doing this. But I have to tell you, the places that aren't, if with a loyal, loving bond, they really ought to start thinking about this as a way of life, as a way of helping those around them. Miroslav Volf, the theologian, wrote that I cannot give anything of value back to God because God needs nothing. You remember this conversation, registrar? Because we had it in your theology class in systematic theology. And a young man from a cohort that's no longer with us argued with me for an hour. It's the longest argument I've ever had with a student. Argued with me for an hour about whether or not God needs something. And I kept trying to say, look, before you existed, God was there. How could he need you? No, he needs our love. No, he doesn't need our love. He gets that inside of the Trinity. From ages, ancient ages past, eternal ages past, God did not have us. He created us. He doesn't need anything. And because he doesn't need anything, I cannot add anything of value to God. He is infinite. By the very definition of infinity, I can't add anything valuable to God. If I could, what would I give him? And the giver is always, the receiver is always indebted to the giver. God is never going to be indebted to me. I can't give him anything enough that would do that. So Volf, after walking us through all of this logic, Volf says, so what exactly can you do to give back to God? And he says, you show your loyal loving to God by your loyal loving to other people. He says, he calls it the so that principle. The more I studied, the more I discovered that theology is really contained in simple words. You have been forgiven so that you can forgive others. You have been loved so that you can love others. You have been given this loyal loving from God. 127 times the Psalms tell you he is a loyal loving God. His loving kindness endures forever. Over and over again it tells us that. You have received that so that you can give it to other people. Not so that I can just give it back to God. God does not need that. God doesn't need you to be a worshiper. He can create stones to worship. What he wants is for you to build a loyal, loving bond with other people to show the world around us what heaven can look like. That is the task, according to Stanley Grins, that's the task of systematic theology, to teach us how to live in a community here that shows, I'm trying to clean up his language because it was all sorts of theological jargon. The task of systematic theology is to teach us how to live with such a loyal, loving bond here that the world around us can see what heaven could be like, to live in fellowship with God and with other people. But when we forsake that, our witness is completely gone. Stand out and preach on the corner as much as you want. Run as many alpha groups as you want. But if you are not bringing them into a healthy community, you have not done anything. That's why Jesus said you will travel over sea and mountain to create a convert. And when you get them, you make them twice as much a son of perdition as they were before. Because the Pharisees had completely broken down on the loyal, loving bond. Jesus was trying to restore it. So when he was asked which one of the 613 commandments was the greatest, he said, love the Lord your God with as loyalty in every area of your life as you can. And the second commandment is equal to that one. Have this loyal, loving bond with your neighbor that will not die. Some of you are probably jumping ahead saying that's kind of an unconditional love. Amazing how unconditional love seems to come with all sorts of conditions. So rather than that term, let me just use the term a loyal, loving bond that says I'm in this with you no matter what. You fall, you end up in rehab, I'm coming to visit you because you're not getting rid of me. We family. We're family. You decide that you're going to stop believing, the Father's not giving up on you and neither am I. We're going to have coffee and we're going to keep talking about anything and everything. A loyal, loving bond that says you might be a jerk today. That's okay. I'm going to love you anyway. And you're eventually going to understand that you're not going to treat people that way. I may call you on it, but I'm going to help you through it. A loyal, loving bond that asks, how are you keeping that bond with each other and with God? And how have you broken that bond with God and with each other? And then ask, what do you do about it once you have? Jason, come on up here for a minute. Jason, come on up here. The cohorts, this is Jason. Jason's a popular student on campus. Jason's a good brother, good guy, good influence. I'll stop because otherwise your head's going to get too big. We won't get you out the door, will we? I brought you up here because I just wanted to show something visibly and physically. It says that if I do something to Jason, Jason ought to come and we ought to talk. And I'll apologize and we'll forgive each other. And if he does something to me, I should do the same thing. Not in a way that's mean, but in a way that restores the relationship. Not just the individual, but the relationship. And a bond that says, Jason, I'm not giving up on you no matter what. And I would hope you're not giving up on me. I would hope that. I would hope that. You don't have to commit. I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm just saying, I would, because I wasn't real sure there, Dr. Coates. I might give up on you eventually.
Right on.
Justice says, you know what, we're in it together. And that's not an option. I didn't get to pick and choose Jason as a brother in Christ. If I would have, if I could have, I would have. He's a good guy. But I didn't get to pick and choose. We're just brothers.
Yeah.
And we're in it together. No matter what.
Right on. Right on.
Thank you. That's it. That's all I am.
Thank you.
That's it. We're in it together. We're in it together. And then if something happens, I'm supposed to go to that person and take care of it. Would everyone close their eyes for a moment? I want you to think about the people sitting around you for a moment. I want you to ask yourself, have I broken faith with them? Am I still in a loyal, loving relationship with them? And I want to coach you on what you should do from this point in time, because if you answer that question, no. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to go to them and make it right. But to do that, I want to teach you how to do that for a moment. You don't go to them and confess everything under the sun. You don't need to bring that into the relationship. All you do need to do is say, I love you, and I think I may have done some things to hurt you. If they're the ones who've done things to hurt you, to own it yourself. Because loyal, loving bonds give to the other person just for the sake of giving to them. And take some of that upon themselves. So just take it upon yourself. Say, you know what, I may have done some things to hurt you, and I just want you to forgive me. And then make it right there in prayer. And if you don't think that you can do that, jump to the second level right away and just grab a more mature brother or sister to have that conversation with you, so that someone can make sure that the relationship itself is restored, because that's the whole point. I know that for some of you, you may have concluded this morning you've broken that loving, loyal bond between you and God, and I want you to make sure that you take care of that as well. But I just want, just for a moment, musicians, you don't need to come so that you can participate. If you have something, you think your brother or sister has something against you, I want you to just go to them and take care of it, because that's what Jesus said to do. I want to give you a few moments to do that. This would be the right time for you to go now. So would everybody stand, please? Would you do that? And if you're not moving to somebody else to pray with them and make it right, would you put your arm around the shoulder of somebody next to you? So just wait just a moment, see if they want to move. And then would you put your arm around their shoulder to be able to pray for the person next to you on either side of you? Because the loyal, loving bond that we have together can be increased by praying for each other.